Hi everyone. I wanted to make a short video to update you on new legislation that has been passed by both houses of the Oireachtas regarding fines and custodial sentences for breaches of Covid-19 laws. On the night of the 21st of October 2020, so last Wednesday, the Irish Government published a new bill titled Health Amendment Bill 2020. In the same way that the Health Preservation Act was rushed through both houses of the Oireachtas inside 48 hours last March, this Health Amendment Bill was also rushed through both houses of the Oireachtas during last Thursday and Friday and is now waiting to be signed into law by the President. If you have seen any of my previous Covid-19 law videos, you might recall me mentioning at different times that certain sections of the Covid regulations were penal provisions. With respect to the Covid regulations, what this meant was that a breach of a regulation that was noted as being a penal provision would open you to prosecution before a judge who could impose a maximum fine of €2,500 or 6 months in prison. So you might ask, if fines and custodial sentences are possible under the Covid-19 regulations, why the Irish Government has decided to enact the Health Amendment Bill and why it was so urgent that it could not be given proper consideration and debate by opposition and was instead rushed through 5 stages in Dáil Éireann and 5 stages in Seanad Éireann in less than 2 days. To be clear, this is not how legislation is passed in a democracy. The reason they have enacted this new fines legislation is very clear. The penal provisions under the Covid-19 regulations were being used sparingly as they were considered disproportionate. And secondly, anyone that was prosecuted under the Covid-19 regulations were taking too long to get to court. And the Irish Government wanted the people to feel the immediate effects of the fines in order to coerce their compliance with the latest round of nonsensical Covid-19 regulations. So let's now take a brief look at the bill that is due to become law in the coming days. The short title of the bill is Health Amendment Bill 2020. The long title of the bill is rather infuriating. It states, "An Act to make further and better provision in relation to the enforcement of regulations under Section 31A of the Health Act 1947, for that purpose to make provision in relation to the prosecution of certain offences consisting of contraventions of those regulations, to provide for the payment of fixed sums by persons alleged to have committed certain such offences in lieu of their being prosecuted for those offences, to provide for the giving of directions by members of An Garda Síochána in certain circumstances and to provide for matters connected therewith." Whereas the disease known as Covid-19 continues to present a very serious risk to public health and the transmission thereof has proved difficult to prevent. Whereas the crisis occasioned by the spread of that disease is causing and will continue to cause significant damage to the economy of the state, resulting thus far in a substantial increase in the number of persons who have become unemployed and a substantial increase in the national debt. Whereas certain measures and prohibitions put in place since the outbreak of that disease relating to the conduct and behaviour of members of society that were aimed at eliminating the disease, reducing the incidence of the disease and limiting its impact on the functioning of society and the economy have not sufficiently reduced the incidence of the disease. Whereas the measures adopted under Section 31A of the Health Act 1947 for the purposes of eliminating and reducing the incidence of that disease and limiting its impact on society and the economy require to be supplemented by further measures. So be under no illusion that this bill is centred around controlling and coercing the conduct and behaviour of members of society. The bill is split over 6 sections as follows. Section 1 provides that the Act of 1947 means the Health Act 1947. Section 2 provides for the insertion of a definition of fixed penalty provision, dwelling event provision and penal provision. Section 3 introduces 2 new concepts. The first is the fixed penalty provision and the second is the dwelling event provision. With respect to both the fixed penalty and dwelling event provision, this bill allows the Minister for Health to make regulations. So you might recall that this was the same power given to the Minister for Health under the Health Preservation Act last March. So the Minister for Health has been given the power to make regulations that will allow him to change a penal provision into a fixed penalty provision or a dwelling event provision. In relation to a fixed penalty provision, what this will do is allow a fixed payment notice to be served on persons who are alleged to have committed an offence under the COVID regulations. This will, I imagine, operate in a similar way to penalty points for driving. So you will receive an on-the-spot fine of up to €500. You will have 28 days to pay it. If you do not pay it inside 28 days, you will be prosecuted and the judge can double the fine in court. This is usually how these type of fines work. It is understood that the fixed penalty provision will apply to issues such as not wearing a face mask, restrictions around travel and attending protests. So if you decide to exercise your constitutionally protected right to protest, once the new regulations under this bill are enacted, it is quite likely that the Gardaí will be permitted to hand out on-the-spot fines to all of those in attendance at protests, and failure to pay these on-the-spot fines inside a set period will lead to your automatic prosecution. And we call this a democratic free country. I say this while at the same time remembering that on the 15th of September of this year, Micheál Martin said that people have a right to protest in a democracy. Be under no illusion that this country is no longer operating as a democracy. With regard to the dwelling event provision, this section will apply to any event held in your private home. This section states that it will be presumed that the occupier of the dwelling is the event organiser. So it is the occupier of the dwelling that will be fined for any breach of the Covid-19 laws unless it is proven that the occupier is not the organiser of the event. This section also provides the range of fines and custodial sentences that will apply on conviction and includes: 1. In the case of a first such offence, a fine not exceeding €1,000 or imprisonment for a term not exceeding 1 month or both. 2. In the case of a second such offence, a fine not exceeding €1,500 or imprisonment for a term not exceeding 3 months or both. And 3. In the case of a third or subsequent such offence, to a fine not exceeding €2,500 or imprisonment for a term not exceeding 6 months or both. This section also states that if the court considers there are aggravating circumstances around the event organised in your home, the court can go straight to imposing a fine of €2,500 and or 6 months imprisonment. So what are the aggravating circumstances that must be present in order to facilitate the court going straight to the maximum fine? Is it perhaps drugs, guns or violence? No, it is the following. 1. The number of persons attending the event at your home. 2. The degree of danger to public health resulting from the event at your home. And 3. The extent to which the person organising the event refuses to comply with requests or directions of a member of An Garda Síochána. Section 4 deals with fixed payment notices in respect of certain alleged offences and sets out how the fixed payment notices will operate. So if a guard has reasonable grounds for believing that a person has committed an offence which contravenes a fixed penalty provision, so this is the likes of not wearing a mask, travelling without a reasonable excuse, travelling beyond 5 kilometres for exercise or attending a protest, then the guard can issue an on-the-spot fixed payment notice. This notice will state that you have 28 days to pay a fixed fine of up to €500 and that failure to pay the fine will result in your automatic prosecution. Note that the guards are permitted to give you the fixed payment notice in person, or they may later send it by ordinary post to your home address. Section 5 deals with powers of members of An Garda Síochána to give directions. This section states that if a person is in a public place and the guard suspects with reasonable cause that the person A. intends to enter a dwelling for the purposes of attending an event organised in contravention of a dwelling event provision, B. is about to enter a dwelling for that purpose, or C. is attempting to enter a dwelling for that purpose, then the guard may direct the person to immediately leave the place in a peaceful and orderly manner. Also, where a guard suspects with reasonable cause that an event in contravention of a dwelling event provision is taking place, the guard may direct the occupier of the home to require all persons attending the event to immediately leave the dwelling in a peaceful and orderly manner. Note that this Section 5 allows the Gardaí only to attend at the main entrance of the dwelling and require the occupier to give his or her name. So the guards cannot, under this legislation, walk around your property looking into back windows to see who is in your home, and they cannot, without a warrant, enter your home without your permission. Section 6 states that the Act shall remain in operation until the 9th day of June 2021, unless a resolution approving the continuation in operation of the Act is passed by both houses of the Oireachtas before that date. You should know that this bill was passed by both houses of the Oireachtas late on Friday night, with 93 votes in favour, 43 votes against and 1 abstention. I've included a link in the description box in this video of the full debate that took place in the Oireachtas around this legislation. If you have time, it is worth knowing what TDs value your freedom and what TDs do not. To be clear, through this legislation, the Minister for Health has been given a blank cheque to draft regulations as he sees fit to decide what will be subject to a fixed charge notice or an on-the-spot fine. And this term blank cheque is not mine. This is the term that was used by 3 separate TDs debating the legislation in the Dáil over the past several days. Deputy David Cullinan said he is asking us to give him a blank cheque to go and draft the regulations, decide what will be subject to a fixed charge notice or on-the-spot fine. That will be solely his prerogative and we will have no say whatsoever in that. Deputy Dennis Naughton said, "We are told we need to socially distance, but the provisions in this legislation are about social isolation, not social distancing." While the legislation before us will give us statutory instruments with the harp on the front of them, the difficulty is that we are giving the government a blank sheet of paper on which to write whatever it wants. Deputy Martin Kenny said the people are very concerned about giving a blank cheque to the government to set out these particular fines and put them in place. The purpose of this legislation is to coerce immediate obedience from members of the public, and I believe it will achieve that. Thanks for listening.